Since the emergence of the film industry in the early 20th century, the idea of auteurism, also called auteur theory, has continuously cropped up in the discussions around the creative process when making films. Although the term wasn't named until 1962 by American critic Andrew Sarris, the concept first appeared in French cinema criticism of the late 1940s. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term, auteur theory is often defined as the idea that the director of a film assumes authorship of that film, much like the author of a play or a novel. When the concept was first identified, it was used to legitimize the film industry as a serious art form alongside the likes of other mediums such as literature and music. Auteurs could be viewed as real artists who had specific visions and stories to tell, and this made it much easier for critics and audiences to latch on to creative individuals behind films, rather than an unnamed cog in the movie studio machine. Before the concept was introduced, films weren't really getting respected as a serious art form, and in fact many of the films made before the 1950s have become lost to time because of this, as they weren't valued for their artistic or creative importance. Once the idea of auteurism started to gain traction, so did people's respect for films, and thus began the evolution into how we see films today. As I've said, when auteur theory was first introduced, it was used to elevate the work of a director on a film to name them as an almost author of the entire production. In early uses of the term, examples such as Alfred Hitchcock were mentioned, as he would use a number of recurring themes and ideas throughout the entirety of his body of work that made any of his individual pieces instantly identifiable. This transformed directors of films into creative forces, where their name meant a specific creative vision for the film with signature ideas and styles to go along with it. Studios began to entrust directors as true artists, giving them total creative control and freedom over the films they were making. Directors were seen as creative geniuses, unrelenting in their vision and aims for a picture, and in many cases this netted extremely rewarding results. Many of the great films from the last 50 years are proclaimed as auteur productions, and their directors have become synonymous with the creative work carried out on these movies, but this often comes at a price to the lesser-known individuals who work on a production. Movies weren't like the other forms of media they were trying to be. Books, for example, were often created by a single individual with little input from others around them. A great novel like War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy was entirely his own creation, from the initial story to the actual finished entity. Films, on the other hand, are inherently a collaborative endeavour. Whilst the director is meant to be a sort of conductor of an orchestra, they're often not the one creating the music. Since I mentioned Hitchcock earlier, let's take one of his most famous films, Psycho. This is a film totally synonymous with Hitchcock's name, so much so that many people may even think that he wrote it. But Psycho was originally a novel published in 1959 by Robert Bloch, and even the screenplay for the film was adapted by Joseph Stefano. The film's iconic cinematography was carried out by John L. Russell, the revolutionary editing by George Tomasini, and the infamous music by Bernard Herrmann. On top of this is the cast of actors who performed the film, which included superb performances from Anthony Perkins, Vera Miles and John Gavin, to name but a few. And this is without mentioning the myriad of talented set designers, costume makers, makeup artists, extras and other extremely hard-working and unsung heroes that so often help to bring these films to life. So why then do we associate a film like this so heavily and solely with its director? I'm of course not trying to diminish Hitchcock's work on the film. It's clear he himself put an unrelenting amount of effort into the film's production, and even financed it. But is it right to hold him up as its author, when in reality the entire film was a collaborative effort? Whilst the director does steer the ship and keep everyone moving forward, if any one of the pieces of the process falters, the entire project suffers. Great films are often never the efforts of one person, but a team of extremely talented and hardworking people with unique ideas, all working together to create something special. Auteur theory often takes away from the importance of these additional people behind a film, in the effort to make one position be seen as a driving force for creativity. In many ways this achieves the intention behind the term in the first place. Films are now seen as a prestigious art form, along with their creators being seen as true artists. But there's also a number of other issues that begin to arise when you make one person the sole creator of a collaborative project like a film. There's been a multitude of instances of misbehaviour by directors towards cast and crew of films in pursuit of some creative vision, often disregarding the safety and security of colleagues around them. One of the most famous cases of this was Stanley Kubrick's treatment of Shelley Duvall on the set of The Shining, often humiliating her in front of colleagues and pushing her to her limit with constant retakes of scenes. Whilst the end result is undeniably fantastic, The control and intimidation Kubrick was able to wield over a cast member, purely because it was his film, is disgusting and horrific. Auteurism is not intended to be a bad thing. There are a number of cases where it works brilliantly. Directors like George Lucas, Quentin Tarantino, and Martin Scorsese are total creative forces that strive to push the boundaries of storytelling within films and advance the medium as a whole. And though in some cases where a director is heavily involved in all aspects of a film it feels warranted to proclaim them as the author, it still ignores the teams of hundreds behind them to make their visions become reality. When employed correctly, auteurism is a great tool to ensure creative vision for a project is achieved. Sometimes it's necessary to put the direction of a project in one person's hands so that it can be seen through to completion with little interference or interruption. Although totally collaborative endeavours are possible, it can be difficult to achieve a ubiquitous vision and identity for a project, and it may require one individual to guide the process. In the game industry, for example, auteur theory has risen and fallen a number of times as the industry has evolved. When games first began, they only required small teams, and a number of games such as the original Super Mario, Tetris and Zelda were all spearheaded by individuals with strong visions and ideas for their projects. As games grew to involve larger teams, the idea of auteurs began to fade in favour of more group-based creative output. There are exceptions, such as Hideo Kojima, who's very much seen as the author of his games, but in large, games are identified by the studio that worked on them and not the individuals. This has its advantages and disadvantages, with credit being spread out across everyone involved in the game and not just its creative director. But it can also introduce the issues of design by committee. Games can begin to feel like a mess of ideas and experiments without a cohesive vision driving the core of production. Some people even push for more auteurism within games, so there are clear directive measures in place for a game to achieve. But whilst there are some merits to this way of thinking, I think it can introduce a number of issues with making one individual creatively powerful over others. Not only in a creative sense, but in a workplace environment with colleagues being mistreated, harassed and disrespected by their superiors, which is all too common in the game industry already. I think auteur theory is here to stay. Although in my opinion it can introduce some toxic behaviours and issues within projects that are inherently collaborative, it can also unite a project's creative vision and direction to achieve something really special. The primary concern is who to give that level of power to. Their intentions have to be for those around them, as well as for the project itself, and they have to be able to take the criticism as well as the praise associated with the success or failure of a project. In some ways, the concept can feel outdated in the modern world, with more affirmative action towards ensuring everyone is fairly credited in workplace environments, but it also feels so deeply embedded in creative industries that it will be difficult to remove the idea entirely. Maybe we'll see more credited collaborative projects moving forward, but it seems the industries and audiences are content with accepting auteurs as the main creative force behind media we consume. And until that changes, we're unlikely to see any deviation from that blueprint that has been around for so long. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like, comment down below to join in on the conversation, and subscribe to see more videos from the channel.